William Howard Taft was the only person ever to reach the highest office in both politics and the judiciary in the United States. After serving as the 27th President from 1909 to 13, he went on to become the 10th Chief Justice of the United States from 1921 to 1930. He was appointed Chief Justice by President Warren Harding in July 1921, and as Chief Justice he swore in Herbert Hoover as the 31st President in March 1929. Taft was also a very big man, the heaviest of all the US presidents. As president, he fought against his weight problem, went on special diets, done exercises, but his weight still ranged between 270 and 320 pounds, which is about 23 stone. The notes and letters between himself and his doctor still exist and provides an early example of the growing awareness of too much weight being a health problem. Taft was born in Cincinnati in the state of Ohio in 1857. He came from a very distinguished legal family. His father, Alfonso, was U.S. Attorney General and served for a brief period in 1876 as Secretary of War under President Ulysses Grant. As a teenager, young William went to Yale University and later attended Cincinnati Law School and qualified as a lawyer and became a judge by his mid-20s. In 1886, at the age of 29, he married Helen Herron. They had 3 children, Robert, Helen, and Charles. Robert later became U.S. United States Senator. Taft continued to rise rapidly in the legal profession, and in 1890, President Benjamin Harrison appointed him as Solicitor General of the United States. He became acquainted with such influential figures as Theodore Roosevelt. However, in 1892, he resigned his position as a Solicitor General and returned to his home state of Ohio to serve in the new position of federal judge in Cincinnati. In January 1900, William McKinley appointed him as civilian governor in the Philippines following the U.S. victory over the Spanish there. 4 years later, Theodore Roosevelt recalled him from the Philippines and appointed him as Secretary of War, and with Roosevelt's support he won the Republican nomination in 1908 and went on to defeat William Jennings Byran in the November election of that year. In his inaugural address, Taft promised to remain loyal to Roosevelt's progressive program. They were good friends, and TR had travelled all over the country campaigning for him. However, as his presidency developed, division within the Republican Party between progressives and conservatives would strain that friendship. Taft's conservatism gradually came into conflict with some of the progressive ideals set out by Roosevelt. In regard to foreign affairs, one of the first actions of the new president was to split the State Department into 3 subdivisions, to look after the separate geographical areas of Western Europe, Asia, and Latin America. He appointed Philander Knox as Secretary of State, and both men were focused more on Latin America than on Europe. They agreed that the primary objective was the construction of the Panama Canal. The canal, once finished, greatly reduced shipping routes between the east and west coasts of the United States, but more importantly perhaps, it also allowed the Navy to move rapidly between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, thereby enhancing the United States as a global power. Taft and Knox also began a policy known as dollar diplomacy in regard to Latin America. This involved the encouragement of US investment and banking there. However, the policy was often rejected by the countries involved, who did not want to become financially dependent on the United States. Many congressmen were actually also opposed, as they recognized that protection of such investments would inevitably lead at a future date to demands for future army interventions. Mexico was also a troubled area during the Taft presidency. Porfirio Diaz had been a military dictator there for decades, but his rule was repeatedly challenged by rebel uprisings and by strikes. Diaz had the opposition leader Francisco Madero arrested prior to the 1911 election, but this led to further uprisings and indeed to his own downfall. The United States already had huge investments in the region. The protection of such investments were often given priority, actually strong priority, over demands for democratic reforms in the area. Taft met Diaz on a number of occasions in order to demonstrate American support for his regime. The British were actually also supporting Diaz in order to gain rights to build a railway track across Mexico in order to join the two oceans by railway. However, this was greatly undermined by the opening of the Panama Canal in 1914. Another issue of concern to the Taft administration was Nicaragua. Nicaragua had become indebted to a number of European nations, especially Germany. There were fears of plans to construct a rival canal through Nicaragua. The Nicaraguan President José Zelaya wanted to pursue an independent policy and rejected earlier deals done with American companies. The United States supported opposition leader Juan Estrada, who became president in August 1910. The new president agreed to accept a US loan, which in effect blocked European plans for an alternative canal. Violence and instability continued, however, and in 1912 Taft sent US troops into Nicaragua, and they remained there until 1933. The construction of the Panama Canal, together with the blocking of any alternative canal, dominated the Taft presidency in Central America. In relation to foreign policy in Asia, Taft considered China very important to US trade and investment. He replaced the US Minister to China, William Rockhill, with the more energetic and persuasive William Calhoun. However, Calhoun didn't get on with Knox, the Secretary of State, and the move proved somewhat counterproductive. However, Taft continued to pursue an open-door policy in regard to China. In regard to domestic policy, protectionism through a high tariff was a basic principle of the Republican Party. The Dingley Tariff of 1897 was one of their proudest achievements. However, over the next decade there was growing awareness that a high tariff was also contributing to high prices at home in the US. Taft tried to reduce the tariff in the Payne-Aldrich Act of 1909, but this debate created enormous tension and division within the Republican Party. Taft combined the new tariff with promotion of the 16th Amendment, which allowed for the creation of a federal income tax and thereby reduced the government dependence on the tariff. The 16th Amendment, however, passed Congress, but it was February 1913 before the required numbers of states supported it. The US economy was booming during the Taft presidency. There was a lot of progress, achievement, and innovation. Taft was the last president to have a cow and horses at the White House. The White House stables were converted into a car garage. Meanwhile, 500,000 Americans owned their own car. A new tourist trade was developing. The car allowed people to travel beyond their own locality and beyond their own state. The Mans-Elkins Act of 1910 strengthened the authority of the Interstate Commerce Commission, which allowed transport and encouraged interstate trade and travel. Taft was also progressive in regard to business, creating the United States Chamber of Commerce in April 1912. He passed through the 16th Amendment, which allowed the federal government to raise income tax, moved away from depending on tariffs, and thereby allowed the prohibition movement to emerge years later. New Mexico and Arizona joined the Union in 1912, the last two mainland states to do so. The population of the United States at this stage was about 95 million. Within a generation, America had become the richest and most powerful nation in the world. The experience of the presidency, however, created division within the Republican movement. Taft and his friend Theodore Roosevelt split on this issue. This reflected a growing division within the Republican movement between progressives and conservatives. The division was most obvious in relation to the tariff, conservation, and antitrust legislation and decisions. The Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act of 1909 was only a marginal reduction in the tariff, but it caused huge division and debate within the party. In relation to conservation, Taft sacked Roosevelt's loyal friend, the Interior Secretary James Garfield, and replaced him with Richard Ballinger. A whistleblower called Louis Galvez exposed Ballinger as having broken official rules by legally representing private interests while serving as a public official. Taft sacked Galvez, who in turn blew the incident into a major scandal, which eventually dragged Roosevelt back into the controversy and international politics. There was also tension between Taft and Roosevelt in regard to antitrust legislation. In 1907, the US Steel Company takeover of Tennessee Coal and Iron Company had Roosevelt's backing. There was a gentleman's agreement whereby Roosevelt promised not to sue them under antitrust legislation. However, 4 years later, in 1911, Taft ignored this agreement and sued them, an action which really outraged Roosevelt, as it made him look naive or even foolish. Such issues split the two men, Roosevelt and Taft, and eventually Roosevelt contested the Republican convention in 1912. However, the party leader supported Taft, who won the nomination by a very small margin actually. Roosevelt left the convention, formed his own party, the Progressive Party, to contest the election anyway. However, he split the Republican vote and allowed Woodrow Wilson to win in a landslide victory with just 42% of the vote. 9 years later, Howard Taft was appointed Chief Justice of the United States by President Warren Harding in 1921, a position he held until a month before his death in 1930. He was actually always more interested in law than in politics. As Chief Justice, he was the prime mover in establishing the present-day Supreme Court. Prior to that, the court did not have its own separate building. They met in several different locations over the previous 140 years. But as a co-equal branch of government, Taft recognised the need for the court to have its own separate building of similar stature to Congress and the White House. As Chief Justice and ex-president, he used his enormous influence and contacts to promote this idea. It took years to plan and build. The Supreme Court opened for the first time in 1935, 5 years after Taft's death. It is perhaps his most enduring legacy.